So these are hopefully on too small, but I'm rewriting my website, and as I said, I went through all my old school reports, and it was just like, wow, how revelationary was this, just in terms of, so this kind of spans the years when we were about 13, I was in France initially. I went on my dad was there with work for about a couple of years, and at that time I started doing really well at school, but all my reports started to say this stuff, and it's like out of a classic textbook, not paying attention, not concentrating. I mean, I was, good, so I get excellent, but noisy, but, everything, and when I didn't like the subject, the teachers were so fed up with me, it's like there was a kind of group of geography, music and whatever, and it's like, crap, D's and whatever in those, and then the ones I liked, it was all great grades and whatever, so, I'd kind of switch on and off, basically, in the class, depending on, we don't have that facility, as other people do, just switch on to something that's not interesting. We can't change that level of stimulation in our brains as other people do to say, even though this is kind of dull, I still need to apply myself to it. That really doesn't work with ADHD. So, and you can see also there's a kind of despair happening in the teachers over the years a little bit as it kind of goes through. So here it's more like, he's doing great. Here it's kind of, he's done what's necessary, presentation is a disgrace, insufficient attention, and then by the end it's going, well, I hope this casual approach to functionality will not lead to him having undue problems when he enters the less strict environment of higher education, which of course I did. I never went to a single 9 o'clock lecture at university. So in a way it is kind of quite depressing to see how these teachers were actually kind of spotting. But what they were doing is completely wrongly telling me it was my problem. They were just kind of going, oh, there's 8-year-old kid, there's a 10-year-old kid who's not paying attention, you should just pay more attention in class. You should just stop making the careless mistakes. There's nothing here, there's no help from any of the teachers in how to fix this. There's no kind of thoughts about, well, maybe if he tried that, or, what about this? Totally dumped on me, as if somehow I was willfully choosing more than the other kids. The kid next to me was, working hard and paying attention, and I was just being completely, whatever, I just wanted to annoy people. I mean, nobody chooses to be lazy. Nobody chooses to be distracted. And so to me, this looks like, a kind of indictment a little bit on the people who are looking after me. And I know we didn't know about ADHD at the time, but it still seems to be a kind of teacher attitude that says problem lies with the child, and not, actually in my style of teaching. And very much what's going on right now with ADHD, I was talking about it earlier, is because we've medicalised ADHD, because ADHD sits in the domain of doctors, it actually stops us addressing some of the root problems of ADHD, which is crap teaching, or bad examinations, or, excessive bureaucracy. There are a lot of problems that people with ADHD don't need to struggle with. If only society would sort itself out a little bit. But while it continues to be a medicalised issue, it kind of ties our hands a bit, because it's like, well, just take the pill, or, we'll just sort yourself out. It's your problem, and it isn't our problem. I think, schools failing 10% or 20% of kids is very much the school's problem, not the child's problem, in my view. I think we perform and behave in different ways from other people, but it's not like we missed a class somewhere along the way where they were teaching social skills and I just turned up late that day or something and didn't know what the... it's not a lack of knowledge that makes us behave differently. It's a set of different motivators and a set of different decisions and a brain that's working in a different way that makes us perhaps be different in our social reactions with others. But it's not a failing. It's not, I know that some people don't like to be interrupted, but that's a social law, and I don't agree with it personally. I think interrupting is really useful and really valuable technique. I think, it stops people talking too long and getting boring. It means you can say something before you've forgotten it. It means that the conversation can be more active. Not everybody would agree with that, but it's a value, and so to say to a child that interrupting is bad, well, that's just majority beating up a minority as far as I'm concerned, that's a different, to understand, however, that people don't like to be interrupted and that sometimes that can cause problems, yeah, that's fine. But to say that interrupting per se is bad, again, I kind of struggle with that. And if you have a group of AEDs together, they'll be interrupting each other all the time, and that's fine. We like that, So again, I think a lot of the social mores are about adhering to the majority's way of behaving. And that's good and bad, and we have to help our kids. And my daughter's had problems with social stuff, so it's not like I haven't tried to help her over the years and trying to adapt, but a lot of it is about adjusting yourself to be different from how you naturally are, and to sit in and conform and comply to the social norms of the other children, and those aren't, that's just their norms. They're not right, but if you're in the minority, quite often then you do have to do things the way the majority operate. So I'm going to just spend a moment going through my model of ADHD, and this is a model that I've used extensively, and I've talked about it, had neuroscientists look at it and psychiatrists look at it, and lots of adults over the years at support groups. I won't spend too long in it, but I think it really helps you get a much bigger and better impression of ADHD. This is much more based on experience, though it includes hard science in it as well. But I was saying earlier that the people who I coach who know least about ADHD generally are the people who are diagnosed as children. And the people who know a lot about ADHD are the people who self-diagnosed as adults. The people who self-diagnose as adults have to work it out. They've lost their floundering. Maybe somebody said you've got depression, somebody said you've got anxiety or whatever, and eventually, after maybe years, they start to kind of put it together and go, my goodness me, I am ticking 20 out of 20 criteria, this is extraordinary, that's kind of me. Whereas often the children, it's other people who've noticed the problems more than the child. It's other people who've seen that they're failing or their issues or whatever, and it's other people who've kind of got them help. And maybe there's meds, and maybe there's a little bit of counselling, but often they don't spend as much time working out what it is to be ADHD and what it is, how I operate differently, from other people. And that's a lot what happens in coaching normally when I'm coaching adults, is figuring out who and what we are. So this is a kind of a way of looking at ADHD. I break it into three basic areas. One's in a desert, missing conductor and seeing patterns. So the first area is how we're understimulated. And that's the pretty hard science of ADHD, is we don't have enough, or we reabsorb dopamine too quickly. It's not hanging around enough, and dopamine, as I say, is a neurotransmitter involved in interest, stimulation and reward. So we're just kind of under-rewarded. So if we're in a desert, it's a bit like we're walking along with our normal companion. They've got a backpack and a little tube, and they can suck at the water at any moment. And we are parched in this desert, and we're absolutely on mission to find an oasis. And they're maybe talking about the birds and the lizards on the dunes, and we're just not paying attention because we're on this mission to get some stimulation, to get some water somewhere. And we see the oasis and we run to it and we dive into the water and quench our thirst. We kind of hyper-focus on it, we suck it up, and our companion comes along and then they go, oh, let's just go on to the next oasis, shall we? And we're going, no, I'm staying here. This is, I'm getting enough sustenance doing this thing, playing my computer game, bungee jumping, pulling somebody's hair, driving my car fast or whatever. I'm getting enough from this thing. I don't want to go into that desert again where I'm suddenly understimulated again. So we tend to have this interest-based focus. We're fine when we're interested. We don't have any problem at all. In fact, a lot of us actually like to think that we do better than other people. We hyper-focus extremely well when it's interesting, and we can really absorb a huge amount of information very, very quickly indeed when we're hyper-focusing. But we don't always have control over that hyper-focus, and it can be completely inappropriate. It might be 2 hours of looking at sheep shearing in the Andes on the internet, and then you kind of go, why the hell have I spent 2 hours on this mad thing? But it does tend to mean that, life is easier if it's interesting. And so, as an adult, engineer your life to be more interesting is the rule with ADHD. Find a job that gives you variety and movement and change and novelty, rather than finding a job that's process-based and that's repetitive. And I coach lawyers and I coach all sorts of other people, but you've got to be, careful to try to get that mix, which isn't the same for everybody, but a mix of kind of variety and movement and interest, makes life a lot easier than to try to fix yourself by taking meds. No, I'm not against meds. I've been on meds. I've been on more meds than anybody I've ever met, actually. And unfortunately, I'm not any right now, though end up causing me some tachycardia and heart stuff. But I also coach a lot of people on medications, and they're no doubt helpful. I think they're overrated. I think the group that they tend to help most are the hyperactive boys. But if you're more inattentive, or your problem is more to do with procrastination than it is to being over-energetic, then they're helpful, but they're not necessarily miraculous. So they're kind of part of the mix of what you need to be doing, but they're not it in themselves, unfortunately. But for me, boredom has been the biggest pain of my life. I mean, and part of the problem is we use the same language to mean completely different things here as well. So when I say boredom, it doesn't mean the same to somebody who's not ADHD. The level of pain that's involved in boredom isn't the same. I mean, sitting at Ballet Rambert for 2 hours with no mobile phone to distract myself, was more painful really than probably having fingernails pulled. I mean, without much, that it can be absolutely discomforting in the extreme. Whereas for somebody who's not ADHD, applying yourself to a tough task maybe isn't great, but it's doable. And there's a big, because we use the same word, I'm bored, we think it all means the same thing, and it really doesn't. We tend to have memory problems, short-term more than long-term, but even long-term memory problems too a bit. So memory is a function of interest. We tend to remember what's interesting and stimulating, the bad stuff, the good stuff. But if you've got an understimulated brain and a distracted brain as well at that, when you put the keys down and you're not paying attention to where you've got the keys and you've got a lot of other stuff going on in your head, often our short-term memories are not great. And that can impact kids at school in terms of learning, holding numbers in their head and holding paragraphs in their head. It gets worse with dyslexia when the memory is even more reduced in those areas. But even with ADHD, it's tough. Somebody gives you a set of instructions, and 20 seconds later you've forgotten what they are. And so for a lot of us, and a lot of adults, use of technology is a big thing here, and beginning to use things like mobile phones and external ways of kind of keeping memories and keeping stuff going. The group of people who's going to most benefit from artificial intelligence is ADHD, no doubt about it at all. Because what AI is going to do in the early days is pick up a lot of those trivial things like, remember Fred's birthday, or, you haven't sorted this thing out or whatever, and, the AIs are going to be helping, and ADD people are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of that, I think. And a lot of ADD adults at the moment, I think, are really benefiting from, integrated diaries and all that sort of stuff. Makes life a lot easier. But as I said before, as a consequence of living in a desert, you become quite aware of what it is that sorts you out, gives you that fix that you need, and as I said, computer games, and I'm 54, I just, bought the latest PS4 game the other day, and I play, I'm looking forward to Just Cause 3, which is coming out very soon. I watch a lot of telly. I've never driven my car under the speed limit pretty much ever in my life. We end up with a lot of behaviours that help us. And if I drove slowly, I'd be worse. I know it's easy for me to say that, but if I really did drive slowly, I really wouldn't be a good driver because I'd be inattentive at that point. I'd be bored out of my mind. I'd be banging my head on the dash, which I do anyway when I get stuck in traffic. But in a way, the reason I want the speed is to keep my attention, to keep it an interesting experience to be driving. So we're often chasing adrenaline. We learn with deadlines, for example. There's a kind of weird learning behaviour that happens with deadlines. So we procrastinate anyway with ADHD. It's the number one issue for adults is procrastination. So we leave things till the last minute, but we learn actually after a while that actually leaving things to the last minute works remarkably well for us because we get a big boost of adrenaline, and adrenaline gives us dopamine, and actually quite often we'll pull amazing rabbits out of hats, over the years, and pass exams after an hour or whatever, or wing our way through a project or whatever, So we learn that this behaviour is quite effective for us. So we end up kind of getting stuck in this kind of adrenaline seeking. I can't possibly start my essay 2 weeks in advance because I haven't got enough attention and stress kind of going on in me. And as I said, for a lot of adults, this ends up in drugs or booze or whatever, we're much more at risk. And cannabis is the number one drug of choice for ADHD. The stimulants are generally the kind of more popular ones. Though interestingly, with cannabis, there's been work going on recently at the Maudsley Hospital, the adult hospital, testing out Sativex, which is a cannabis extract for ADHD. And there's a lot of science that it is both a bit negative but also quite beneficial for ADHD. They haven't quite worked it out yet. But hopefully there will probably be some drugs based on THC at some point in the future. Because as an adult, I'd rather be on THC personally than I would on a stimulant. And and as an adult with getting older in years, I don't really want to be on a stimulant that stimulates my heart, when my heart's not able to be stimulated. As a consequence of this dopamine problem, the frontal lobes, the bit behind the forehead, they communicate to the kind of rest of the brain by what are called dopaminergic channels. So they're using dopamine to actually affect their communication with the rest of the brain, and we have problems with dopamine. So they don't get through so well. So these additional functions, and as a coder, a programmer over the years, I think of the brain a little bit like a computer or whatever. Most, or all animals, I think, except for maybe chimpanzees, don't have frontal lobes, and we didn't have frontal lobes until pretty late on in our evolutionary history. So we worked pretty well before we had them. It's not like they were completely, when people start talking about them as being the manager of the brain, which one or two scientists do, that seems a bit ridiculous to me, how you would have had the manager added on late on in our evolutionary history. I think they're a modifier. They modify the behaviours of the rest of the brain, and the main three areas that they get involved in is the emotional reduction of, inhibition of managing, an extreme low-level emotional reaction, anger or whatever, and they actually inhibit that and kind of reduce the kind of effect of that. Also, with sleep, they get involved in helping us kind of regulate our sleep. I mean, how many of you with ADD kids have got terrible problems with getting them to bed on time and all the rest of it? 70% of people with ADHD have what's called late sleep onset. We don't produce enough melatonin at night, which is the sleep hormone, and we don't produce enough cortisol in the morning, which is the wake you up chemical. So with your kids, it's started now, but it'll get possibly worse as they move to adulthood. You find actually that what happens with adults is we find the evenings are great because we can really indulge in them. It's the time when we've got guilt-free play. We might all day long have been messing around and not doing good stuff, and feeling bad about it, but by the time the evening comes, nobody expects you to be working at 1 o'clock in the morning, so you can be kind of playing then. And so for lots of adults, it ends up being a big problem fighting the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, bedtimes, and trying to constantly kind of rein them in. But with this kind of brain that's always kind of drifting in that direction. And of course, lack of sleep is like double plus ADHD. So, if you take anybody and they're sleep deprived, a normal person, so they become forgetful and distracted and less motivated. Have that with somebody with ADHD, you're just making it much worse. But it's a difficult combination. We don't think about the future with ADHD. We're really very present in the moment, which can make us really very, effective. And in fact, in certain circumstances, like emergency circumstances, ADHD people seem to trump normal people with thrive on that additional adrenaline when it's an emergency, and we're very present. But when it comes to kind of thinking ahead and thinking about the future, it's like we lack for a clock and a calendar in our heads that other people seem to have. So we might intellectually get the point of doing the essay. It's not like we're stupid and we don't realise that it needs to be done or whatever, but it doesn't work at the level of the motivational apparatus in the brain. It just doesn't get us to do the thing. We kind of discount the future. So it's like, if the thing is immediately interesting and available, I'll have it, rather than if it's long-term kind of valuable, from the point that just looks like it's kind of now or not now to us, and that's just not now. So, and this really, causes us, I think probably in adults the biggest issues of all. And we also don't tend to comply. There's 40% of people in jails, or 50% or whatever, you hear all sorts of figures around being ADHD or whatever. That's partly due to drugs. And the fact that we criminalise drugs, and then we criminalise the people who use drugs, and then they need money, and then they go in jail. In America, there's 1 million people in jail. I think 1/4 of the world's jail population is in jail, and mainly for drug offences, and I think if you look at those, a huge proportion of those are ADHD. But it also means that, we are natural rebels. We question, how many kids of yours would say why excessively? It tends to be a kind of, we don't take any rule at face value. If there is a rule, if there's a 20-mile sign on a road, I'll kind of go, does it make sense? There's one there, okay, I'll adhere to it. Well, it doesn't really make any sense, I'll just ignore it altogether, But it's kind of like we pick and choose a little bit. Not that we're amoral, because in fact I think often people with ADHD are extremely moral, because we don't take it off a shelf. We construct our own moral frameworks quite often, our own sense of what's right and wrong, rather than borrowing society's kind of lists. But again, it puts us in all sorts of difficult positions. And then this is the final piece, and this is where the difference of ADHD tends to kind of start to work positively for us, and that's that we seem to be a bit more right-brained in the way that we operate. The science is pretty clear. Unfortunately, the ADD science isn't, but if you look at the science of the brain, it's pretty clear that we are. We're much more in the domain of seeing patterns and seeing how things connect. We love to learn things at root value. We like to learn things from very first principles. We don't like to remember things, we're no good with the dates and the names and whatever, but we really want to grasp the core essence of things, which we're not taught in school. So schools completely screw up for ADHD because they're now very linear, they're very memory-based, they're telling you this process and this procedure and you just need to do A, B, C or whatever, and the ADD kids want to go, yeah, but how does it work? What is it? Give me the fundamentals of this thing, because once we grasp the fundamentals, we've already got them. but trying to make us, fit in our head some little. I was saying with my daughter, with her English essay, she's been taught some hideous acronym 6-letter thing that she has to do whenever she writes an essay, and so it becomes a feat for her to remember this crappy school process, as opposed to being an inherently good writer of essays, which she would be if she was allowed to be, rather than being constrained by the school's kind of process. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, education has gone seriously downhill for ADHD people, even from my time. I mean, it wasn't great when I was a kid, but I think it's much worse today. At least when I was a kid, it was exams-based, and often ADD kids do better in an exam-based situation. If I was doing continuous assessment, crikey, I don't know how I would have done in school. But we do tend to be more creative. There are some really good scientific studies, 60 students in America, I think it was in Milwaukee, on every measure of creativity, the ADD kids were better than the normal. I took part in an experiment at UCL that proved kind of that ADD people notice more. We tend to see an awful lot more. They were throwing a whole lot of peripheral images in a performance test, and ADD people retain a far more information like that. So, it puts us in, the people I coach are generally entrepreneurs. They're people who are helping other people, and ADD people are very good at that. They're people who are kind of in unique jobs, who have a hybrid set of different skills. They're good with sales, and they're good at a bit of this. There's often a kind of a mixture of different kind of jobs that we gravitate. Apparently a lot of people in emergency services are ADHD, a lot of ambulance drivers are ADHD, high stimulation jobs that people kind of go towards. But we do, I think, we are valuable, and often not everyone. Obviously a lot of people with ADHD have an awful lot of problems and issues or whatever. But amongst that group of people with ADHD, look to be some of the most amazing individuals the world has seen. The most amazing inventors. If you look at Edison, he was hyperactive and was homeschooled and invented tons of things, but hardly finished any of the projects he was on. Leonardo da Vinci the same. Certainly in terms of the explorers' history. Boredom is a massive reason for exploration, so I think, we do litter through history, of ADD people who've done amazing things. So, for me, I think it's focusing on the strengths, focusing on the good, focusing on the talents or the interests or whatever, and trying to shift away from an excessive focus on the negative, because, focusing all your time on the things that you're bad at doesn't really add up to an awful lot, unfortunately. Though we have to, conform, and we do have to comply within the society that we live in, unfortunately. But just as an example, I mean, often an ADD teacher, for example, will be a very competent teacher. They'll be very empathetic. The kids will warm to them and really like them. They'll be a really good storyteller. They'll be really engaging. They'll be really interesting. But they'll be in trouble today because they won't be doing all their reports. They'll be back on, writing up everything on the kids or whatever, and they'll be failing, even though actually they're a really good natural teacher. And that's kind of a little bit the world that we built for ourselves, which is very regulated and very tied down and very bureaucratic, unfortunately. Feeling, disconnected, I think, from peers probably is one of the biggest, I think, issues with ADHD. And parents, I mean, as a parent myself, I'm watching my daughter struggle with, her friends as well at school, and not being able to kind of find people who kind of quite match with her slightly rebellious nature and slightly different nature or whatever. It's harder, isn't it? Because if you're 1 in 10 and you're trying to find, or 1 in whatever, you're trying to find somebody who's a bit like you. And and if you're in a minority, there aren't so many people who are like you. So it's actually kind of hard sometimes at school to find people who just match your interests and match your desires. I mean, do people feel that's part of the problem with their children? It's not that their child is particularly weird per se, it's just they're not finding other kids to kind of match with and to have a relationship with. And I think for us as parents, it's just despairing, isn't it, when our child is, and we so want to help them, and it's so hard. It's so difficult to actually be around. And I think there's a big piece about, social conformance and compliance at this age, and certainly as they get into teens and whatever, and, and there's a lot about feeling accepted, and being part of a group, but also, at the same time wanting to be yourself and to find your personality. So I think I went out to look a bit about this topic on the internet and to look at social skills and what people have to say. And I read this statement here, which was on Attitude magazine somewhere, and I kind of read it. In one way it really makes an awful lot of sense, but on the other way it's just like it offends me so much to read it, that I don't quite know, and I'm certainly not counselling that we shouldn't help our kids be able to kind of integrate and deal with better with the other kids at school. And I often do that with adults at work, is, you know, like you've got to recognise, I was saying I coach a lady, she's a tax inspector and works in a company of accountants, 6 male accountants. She was having a huge amount of problems with communicating and missed stuff going on. Nobody seemed to, and it, you know, it took to really work out that she's basically working with 6 ASPE men, and she's the one ADHD woman. And what a complete, you know, contrast in the whole way that those heads operate. You know, we're all very physically different, aren't we? We all allow ourselves our height and breadth and whatever differences, but when it comes to heads, we kind of project our heads on everybody else, or imagine everybody else is the same as us. So, you know, with this lady, you know, she was, you know, full of ideas for marketing, and which was kind of scaring these more, you know, kind of, you know, people who were a little bit more kind of less ambitious in their thinking, that they were less emotional, and she was interpreting that as being they didn't like her or whatever, you know, huge on a million levels as kind of communication going. So to me, I think a lot of it is about just kind of working out how you operate and how other people operate, and then going, well, maybe I do need to compromise how I operate, or I need to find a way to communicate with other people, or but I don't think it's about skills. I mean, as I said, I'm not sure that our children miss the classes where the social skills were handed out and that they're not aware. You know, it's not like they didn't realise. You know, sometimes there's some reminding, and sometimes there's some gentle prompting and whatever involved, but you know, it more is, you've got difference. There's difference there. There's, you know, your child has different motivations, different interests, different desires from the others, and so it's then there is a little bit of compromise and say, well, what do you need to do? You know, is it worth the compromise to get the results? You know, or do you need to maybe find other friends who are more like you, or you know, what it is? You know, what's the best recipe? Does that? Am I sounding mad talking from this attitude, or is that making sense? So here is some kind of more conventional advice. I love this picture. I've always thought this picture was great. I think that really does express what we are with ADHD. You know, we're looked on from the outside. I mean, okay, sometimes when we're bouncing around and jumping around, we might be noticeably different. But it's not that visibly different to be ADHD. But inside, boy oh boy, are we different. You know, and you know, we operate on a huge different. You know, one thing that's so true with adults, for example, is that no adult with ADHD is motivated by money. I mean, not one. I mean, we like money, certainly, but it's a terrible motivator for ADD. It won't get you out of bed day after day. You know, if you've got a £1 million job, the first couple of days you'd be full of enthusiasm. But if it was all admin or whatever, by the third day you'd be giving up and turning up late. You know, it's just not part of how ADHD people engage with the world. You know, is money. It's too ephemeral. You know, if the job, however, is fascinating and interesting and full of buzz and movement or whatever, then you're going to be there 8 o'clock every day having a fantastic time. You know, so there's some really kind of fundamental differences in how we operate. So I think, you know, there is a lot of this stuff about, you know, trying to match to the other children, you know, in terms of emotional intensity, in terms of, you know, how you interrupt or how you communicate. So certainly a lot of observation and feedback, you know, about what happens when you do that and why do you think that happened, exploring it with the child, try to kind of actually go back through the whole sequence in some detail and try to figure out what they thought and what their motivations were, why the other kids might have been thinking differently, you know, how the other kids, again, not from a right or wrong perspective, but just like, okay, well obviously that kid cares much more about punctuality than you do, or obviously they seem to be more upset by, you know, it doesn't mean that the child is wrong for doing interrupting, but it's more like learning that the world is full of people who have a whole bunch of different ways of reacting, and therefore being kind of sensitive to those, and then, you know, and then finding a means to be able to kind of communicate with those other people. Sometimes it's things like proximity. I think quite often when we see things like there's aspects come in. I coach a few, particularly men who have got some Aspie traits as well, and obviously that really magnifies some of the social difficulties, you know, that people have. And often there's a shyness. There's a kind of, you know, difficulty in quite, you know, comprehending why other people have reacted as they do, and a kind of difficulty in perhaps with ADHD we might not behaving as conventionally, but we know not behave used conventionally. I think there's a little bit less awareness of that with Asperger's. But again, I think it's very much about talking through the scenarios, talking through how the other kids might react and why they might react, and then I think coaching your child. And this is I think a really big point for me about coaching. I get adults sometimes coming to me and say, will you help my child? And often it's like the 16-year-old, 17-year-old boys, who are in trouble and not doing very well, and the mum's hoping I'll rescue the situation sometimes. But it's a group that I'm really reluctant to help, actually. One, they're a very difficult group to help, and it's going to maybe take a few years for them to kind of get through it. But also I'll get cast as a parent in that role, and that's not what I want, that's not what I do. I don't nag people as a coach, I'm part of somebody's team, and we're kind of talking together about the problems, and trying to come up with some sensible ways of kind of cracking them, based on the fact that the person is ADHD, not ignoring their ADHD, but based on that. We're trying to kind of work that together, but I'm not trying to tell them what to do, and I'm not trying to tell them what's right and kind of wrong. We're trying to figure that out together, and I think, as a parent, that's what you can do with your kids much better than a third party can, is to sort of in a way move it from sitting on opposite sides of the table to sitting on the same side of the table. There's a shared problem between you and the child, which is, the friendships or whatever, and then to kind of work it out, to talk it through, and then to try to help your child almost articulate a possible solution rather than you can guide them to it, fairly carefully to get to the point you want, but more to kind of actually work together to kind of come up with well, how would it be, tomorrow if instead of doing that you did this? Do you think that would work? Would that quite the other kids? How do you think they would respond? Try to problem solve it, because then they've got ownership of it. It's not that they're not being told that they're wrong. They're not being corrected. They're just being understood. But yeah, there is a problem. There is definitely something here that needs to be fixed, and we need to kind of fix that together. But it's not that the child is wrong, because then you just become another one of a whole list of people who are making that poor ADD person feel bad. And self-esteem is major with ADHD. It's a chemical problem. We have low self-esteem as well as a life experience problem. So chemically, because of our dopamine problems, we get less reward. We therefore don't reward ourselves. So generally, and we also tend to be perfectionists, so we tend to never feel, no matter how, whether the ADD is a millionaire or not, nobody with ADD tends to kind of feel, fantastic. And then often life has contributed a lot of problems, a lot of issues along the way. And self-esteem is so precious. It's the single biggest indicator of success in life. More than money, more than intelligence, more than anything else, is good self-esteem is the single biggest indicator. So to me, that's the most precious thing with our kids. And that's what I've really worked hard with Maddie over the years, is to, not have it be her problem. It's like, wow, isn't that frustrating that you're not able to find somebody who's cool like you at school? As opposed to, well, her mum's response is, well, you should just, suck it up, and you don't like them that much, but you should be their friend or whatever, and so it's a delicate balance, I think, but I think it's one we really have to watch for. So again, reading the literature, I tend to be sometimes a bit rude about advice that other people give. I call it kind of Nike advice. I used to have this really good picture of a little boy peeing up against a Nike "Just Do It" sign on a wall. Because the just word is the offensive word to somebody with ADHD. It's not just go to bed on time, or just do the essay, or just, because that's our problem, is the just, It's much more difficult for us to just do that thing. So when the advice is of that kind of nature, then the advice generally is setting you up for a failure, I think. So for example, like, if your bedroom's messy, then here's the 10 steps to having a tidier bedroom. You just need to do this. Well, of course, I know how to tidy a bedroom. It's just I don't want to, because it's a boring chore to have to tidy the bedroom, So just telling me that I can do it like that doesn't really resolve the problem. And when you give advice in that manner, then you are setting somebody up for failure. Because often when something's new or different, then there's interest in it, and somebody's prepared to give it a go. Somebody's prepared to try a few days of using this new planning system, or 2 days of trying to get up early, or whatever it is. But then there's generally, because you've not really focused on the just, there's failure. Then the person stops getting up early in the morning, or stops doing the planning, and then there's yet another failure in life of that person. And that happens a lot with adults. with ADHD, where they go see a well-meaning professional, a therapist or a doctor or whatever, who starts giving them this just do this kind of advice, and everybody's hopes get up, and then they go off, and this happens a lot with CBT, for example, with adults. They're given this new wonderful process of handling these things and sent off, and then 2 days later or a week later, they're not doing it anymore. Nobody kind of figured out how do you keep this process going, and how do you find them. And that's what I spend all my time with coaching, is in the just. How do we make them into a habit? How do we find a way that's going to sit with you and not, like scheduling an adult. Adults with ADHD often are very poor at scheduling their time. We're flying by the seat of our pants and doing what's immediately interesting in front of us or whatever, and so then you think, oh well, the natural thing to do is let's just make sure your week's a bit more structured, a bit more scheduled, and you've got 2 hours here doing this. But we're rebels. And the idea of being completely scheduled down to every hour or every half hour is like a nightmare for somebody with ADHD. So, you've got to find a way to do the scheduling, but with a light enough touch that's bearable for the person with ADHD. So this is why I kind of put this a bit, I'm not saying that this isn't appropriate stuff to do, but you've got to be wary of, this is this kind of Nike style thing that says, just, think ahead of what to say ahead of time. That's easy to say, isn't it? But not necessarily easy done. Go with the flow of the group. Well, the group can be pretty damn annoying, and you don't really want to go with the flow of the group. So again, that's a nice, easy piece of advice, but there's more complexity involved than just simply say. As a kid, I went through times when I was lonely of friends and times when I had great numbers of friends. I remember when I was particularly, I don't know, 6 or 7, all my friends were playing football. I can't stand sport. I found sport boring throughout my life. There was no interest whatsoever for me, and so I was lonely. But, should I have learned to play football and tried to enjoy it, and whatever? No, not really, So, there was a kind of problem there, but certainly not resolved by a simple solution. And incidentally, I didn't mention it along with my report, but there's a kind of interesting phenomenon you get with ADD kids. I don't know whether you see it with any of yours, but we don't want to be part of an individual group. We want to actually be members of a number of different groups. We want to be able to float around and move around. We don't want to be tied into that group of 3 or 4 friends. So in my case, I had nice, spoken, reasonably well-educated friends on one hand, but I used to go up with the mad kids as well, throw mud at cars and set rubbish bins alight and do all these kind of mad things, And it was like, now when I think about it, it was like this weird schizophrenic kind of existence I was having where, part of it was just, conforming and complying, and then I would just go off and do these other completely crazy, exciting things with often the bad kids, to kind of keep both sides in. So I think, it is though about, helping your kid maybe, figure the other kids out, figure out what they're looking for, what's their interest, how are they reacting, maybe kind of figuring out some of these do's and don'ts, that, the areas where the other kids maybe get most upset or most offended or most likely to exclude you, or, and I think there's a lot of sense, here in, trying to find a common interest with others, obviously, not disrupting games that other people are playing, and even if you've got a great idea, trying to find a way of sharing it, that the other kids can listen to and hear. I think that there is sense in this, but to me, greater is to actually help your child. One, do the things that they need to do. Don't have this parental attitude that they should learn. I haven't learned stuff. I'm 54. There's still quite a lot of stuff that I haven't kind of learned because it's just not how I operate. I mean, with friends, adults with ADHD often are quite good, sociable people, engaging, quite often the life of the party or whatever. But often they are poor with friends because friends need planning. Friends need you to think ahead to the weekend and go, oh, there's a weekend coming up, and I haven't got anything planned for the weekend, and actually, in order to get my friends, I've got to email that person and find that location. There's a lot of damn planning involved. So quite often adults with ADHD start to hemorrhage friends and lose friends and don't keep up the connections with them. And the solution is that maybe you need to spend a bit of time on a Thursday evening, fixed on texting a few people or connecting a few people or whatever, but it never becomes straightforward. It never becomes natural. And there's nothing wrong with, as a parent, in helping and scaffolding your child in these things. You know, it's not that you're disabling them or whatever, you know, just being a team with them. And then maybe your child will grow older and they'll have to rely on somebody else. Maybe they'll rely on their partner or their husband or their coach or whatever it is to help them keep doing those things in the future. It's not, you don't have to figure it all out from within, as long as you've got an overall solution to the problem, and that can involve parental help. I think that's fine, because the bigger issue here isn't your child necessarily learning the skills of phoning other people. It's the important thing is that they have the friends, you know, right now that they've got the friends. So I don't see anything wrong with you talking through your kids about their social life, you know, engineering parties, bringing friends over to some amazing event that makes them think your kid is more amazing because they did some amazing thing with your kid or whatever. Any of that kind of manipulation I think is fine. You know, and again, you know, if you're good at this stuff, you know, then again, it's, you know, perhaps, you know, team up and find a time, you know, when you maybe do chat about friends, things or whatever, let them come up with their ideas about how they might fix things, add in your bit, you know, and then come up with a plan. So what are you going to do next? What are you going to do tomorrow? You know, we're not very good at long-term stuff, but, you know, if we focus in on immediate actions, what are we going to do next? Then that can work really well. I quite like this, having emergency kind of exits for us. A few years ago, there was a Christmas party at my girlfriend's house with a lot of people in the house or whatever, and I couldn't see Maddie around, and I wandered around the house and I went up to upstairs lounge and she was sat on her own in the lounge upstairs, and I was going, oh, okay. Hi Maddie, are you okay? And she said, yeah, no Dad, I'm fine. I was just a bit overwhelmed and I was just taking a moment out. And I went, ah. Because the word overwhelmed was a word I'd really conspicuously given to her as a piece of vocabulary that she could actively use, because it is a state that we often feel with ADHD, that we're overwhelmed because of this high emotional reaction to things. You know, emotions just can be too much. We kind of get locked down or whatever. But what she was able to do is she had a name for it. She knew what was going on, she knew how she would fix it or whatever, so she had her little strategy to deal with that thing, and I was like, wow, eureka, you know, that's fantastic, that, you know, she's kind of known that's how she is, and she knows the pattern of behaviour, and she knows the solution, and she knows she'll come out of it. So I think, you know, having ways that you handle particular tricky situations and having worked them out in advance, you know, and it could be like an adult who goes to a party, and again, with ADD, we're often, you know, we like maybe chatty parties where we get to talk with people or whatever. We don't like chit chat, you know, like, you know, just talking about the weather or whatever can drive some of us mad. You know, I would avoid a social party like that with any language I could, you know. So having an emergency exit so you can kind of go, if the party does truly turn out to be bad, I've kind of pre-given an excuse to get out of here, and, you know, or somewhere I know I can go or I can avoid or whatever, you know. But, you know, and it may be different from your kids, but, you know, when they're at their birthday party, you know, what are they going to do? Or, you know, to kind of rehearse, you know, to work through a little bit so that, you know, you're not having to deal with that situation in the raw, emotionally, in the moment. You've actually kind of, in a way, worked through it and you know how you're going to do. If you end up feeling like that, and we were talking with a mother about her son being, you know, depressed or whatever. So if you have depression or whatever, then if you start to know the cycle of the depression, you know, they withdraw for a day and then typically they come out after this, then, you know, kind of give it a name, know the cycle of that thing, know how it goes through, you know, make it a joke, make it awareness, but then, you know that that's not the end of the world, you know, that when you get down it's going to last 2 days and then you'll come back out of it, or, you know, that if you're feeling really, really anxious, then the thing to do is run away and go to the toilet for 5 minutes or whatever, but having some of those things, I think, pre-planned. I think probably, I think my fundamental, you know, view of ADHD, I came up with those 3 words, they're not original words by any means, but I came up with them years ago and they've stuck with me. I think 8 years they just came into my head, and I still feel to this day that that is the mantra of living happily with ADHD, is to understand it, you know, and I think it's really important you help your child understand why they act differently and what's going on differently in their head, and then, you know, that's partly why I have that model, is to try to make that a kind of an easier explanation for people. But, you know, why do I react like that? And, you know, why do other people not react like that? And, you know, what's going on? So that then, from that basis, you can start to work out strategies or how to deal with things or whatever, because you kind of know that's how you act. You know, if you know how you operate and react, then, you know, when you're thinking about O-levels or A-levels or university or job or whatever, then you can kind of go, well, I know that's probably a bad idea to do that thing, and this is maybe more likely, that this is going to be successful for me. It's more likely that, my daughter's looking at, the A-level she's going to do at the moment, and one of her considerations is, exam versus coursework based, because she knows that coursework's bad for her, and that exams are better, and so kind of that level of awareness helps make intelligent, informed, choices about what we're doing. Acceptance, though, is part of it too, because, some stuff we don't work as well as other people, and there are some things I'm really crap at, I'm terrible at admin, I'm very, forgetful of, birthdays. I never send anybody a Christmas card. There are certain things that I could continue to beat myself up about those things, or I can kind of let them go and kind of go, okay, I know I have a weakness there, but I'm going to focus more over here on, what's important. But often people end up getting stuck into this loop where they're unhappy about themselves, about something, and they're not fixing it, and then they just continually feel upset about it. To me, it's either do something about it, but just, okay, it's not great, it's not perfect, I wish I was taller, I wish I was this, or whatever, but that's just how I am, and I'm not going to waste, unnecessarily kind of brain cycles on being miserable, about that thing. And then finally, embracing their ADHD. I think, again, we were talking about context being everything with ADHD. School as a context is often difficult for people. It's rigid, it's prescriptive, it's whatever, it's not necessarily the optimum environment for somebody with ADHD to be. But there are other environments, where, as I say, maybe you're an ambulance driver or whatever, it's perfect, you're half asleep half the time, and then there's an emergency, and you're zipping across town at 90 miles an hour or whatever, and, it kind of gives you that, fit, with how you operate. So, embracing, really kind of moving towards saying, what are the things that really motivate me, what are the things that, make me excited or interested or whatever, and kind of work with that, I think, rather than to be trying to force yourself to be something you're not.